Okay, we should get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone, and thank you for coming, especially to the students who are preparing for their exams. My name is Tess Del Rosario. I am Senior Research Fellow at the Center on Asian Globalization at the Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. This afternoon, we're very pleased and very honored and very grateful for a guest speaker who flew all the way from Kabul in Afghanistan to come here and to talk to us about how you govern a country who's facing very difficult conditions. Dr. Hamish Nixon is currently the Subnational Governance Specialist for the World Bank based in Kabul. But actually his background is pretty much like you and me. He was an academic for quite a while before joining the World Bank. In fact, he's only been there for a year. Before that, he was a governance researcher at the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, also based in Kabul, where he was working for 5 years, right, Hamish? 3 years. 3 years. His work experience also spans, well, similar countries. He's done his thesis on Cambodia and El Salvador, working on questions of post-conflict democratization. And he's done electoral monitoring for countries like Kosovo, Serbia, the Palestinian territories, and in 2004, he was a monitor for the Indonesian elections. I'm sure there's going to be lots of interesting questions after his presentation, so let me not delay this further and give the floor over to Dr. Hamish Nixon.
Hi. Thank you very much for coming, and I wanted to thank particularly Tess for tracking me down in Afghanistan, which is not always easy, and being very supportive in getting it arranged for me to be able to come here through some different changes in scheduling on my side and on the school side and amid general global turmoil. It's a really good opportunity for me as a researcher and a kind of practitioner in the field to be able to take a little bit of a step back, take a deep breath, and try to make some reflections, practical reflections and academic reflections on the experience in the last few years in Afghanistan. I really hope that all of you will feel free to engage aggressively on the subject today as well, because it's a benefit for me to get out of Kabul, which can be a little bit of an echo chamber in terms of policy. We run in quite limited circles, and often you hear your own ideas coming back to you. And so I'm really looking forward to engaging with you and discussing the issues that come up with people who are, engaged in the topic, but perhaps can bring a little bit of distance and perspective to bear as well. So that's something which I'm really looking forward to. And being in Kabul for 4 years may be a good way to develop some expertise on the subject, but it might not be a good way to get that perspective. So this is a great opportunity for me again. Just quickly, I'll outline what I'm going to try and do, and I'm going to try to keep the presentation as short as I can, so there's a lot of time for discussion and questions, at least half an hour, I hope. The first thing is that perhaps left to myself, I might not have chosen such a grand title for the talk, but I think it's a provocative title, and one that's very interesting, because now that it's there, it gives me a kind of challenge to consider. And the first thing I want to do is maybe just talk a little bit about what people seem to think about, in my experience, when they ask the question, how should Afghanistan be governed? And then I'm going to run through a little bit of history, because I won't assume that everyone's got a comprehensive knowledge of Afghan history, but I'll run through it, some state formation aspects of the history very quickly, and with the caveat that I myself am not a historian of Central or South Asia. And then a little bit about the current situation, again, from a state-building point of view, and that should set us up for, I think, the interesting part of the presentation, and especially the discussion, which will be about the dilemmas around the subnational level, any governance level below the national level, and state building there, as well as the implications for the aid dependency of Afghanistan and the aid architecture there on those dilemmas. And then I'd like to lob a few ideas your way about how I see the way forward in the areas I work on in my professional life. And I again, call on you to engage aggressively with those, because I think it's important to, for us to discuss them openly. I'm well aware that it's possible in organizations like the World Bank to start thinking in the same way that everyone else does, or to assume that there's only one way out of a particular situation, especially where technical solutions are often brought to the forefront. I don't think I'm a person who privileges technical solutions over political ones, and I think my experience of living in Afghanistan for 4 years has made sure I don't do that. Can everyone hear me all right? Good. So, in terms of thinking about how to govern Afghanistan, I think a lot of people have this question on their mind at the moment. And the reason I wanted to talk about a bit of the history is because I think often the way people think about the question is by drawing historical analogies. Something in the past worked well or didn't work well, and therefore that tells us something essential about the nature of Afghanistan. And I think people tend to divide up their answer to this question, at least internally, into sort of two pieces. One is, what's the nature of the relation between state and society? Both looking at the past, what was the nature of the relation between the state and society, so we can think about what is the basis for legitimacy of the state. How does the state gain its support from the society? This is a general question about all states, but it's a question which I think people bear in mind when they're asking about governing Afghanistan. The second is, what is the nature between the center of the state, the Kabul, the capital, and the rural areas of Afghanistan, or the peripheries, or the borderlands? There are different conceptual, theoretical tools that have been used to talk in political science about borderlands, about failed states, etc. But the fact of the matter is that Afghanistan, the Afghan state, is centered in Kabul. For much of its history has been almost entirely contained within Kabul. Some people have said in the last few years that President Karzai is in fact the mayor of Kabul. I think that's an exaggeration. But this question of the relationship between the center and the periphery is a very central one when people are thinking about Afghanistan. The third one, which I haven't put up there, is about the relationship between Afghanistan and external powers, and that's maybe the crucial one. But since most of the people who are currently thinking about the future of Afghanistan, governing Afghanistan, are either external powers themselves or tied up with them, they maybe don't think about this openly enough. So I'm going to get to a little bit of the history now, and I think we should bear in mind these two questions. One is, how does the state relate itself to society, and is that a successful relationship? And secondly, how does the center relate to its borderlands, and is that a successful relationship? Because I think this is the framework that either subconsciously, implicitly, or explicitly people bring to the question of governing Afghanistan. So the sort of potted history. Afghanistan sort of began its sort of independent existence with the formation of a tribal confederacy in 1747 under Ahmad Shah Durrani. And he did this by forming a range of tribal alliances among different Pashtun tribes. It's important to note that at this time in its history, the term Afghan, for example, referred to a Pashtun, referred to a Pathan. And as Ahmad Shah, his tribal name Abdali, became Durrani when he became king, formed these tribal alliances. This brought the domination of the Durrani Confederation over the Ghilzai Confederation. So this is a large grouping of tribes. Within those confederations, you have a number of tribes, sub-tribes, clans, etc. And that dominance has actually remained to this day. President Karzai is a Durrani Pashtun. Every ruler of Afghanistan, with the exception of one, since then has been a Durrani Pashtun. And since 1930 has been from the Mohammedzai clan of the Durrani Pashtuns. So this process of forming tribal alliances has been an important feature of state formation throughout, but you could say it was the entire state at that time. And the way that these alliances were cemented was not through sort of domination or conquest internally, but rather over agreements about raiding and dividing the spoils of raiding in neighboring territories, the Punjab, Kashmir, and Iran. And at that time, the Pashtuns, of course, were known for being very successful conquerors of neighboring territories, so there were plenty of spoils to divide among the tribes, and that was the way that state formation took place at that time. Maybe it's an exaggeration to call it state formation. What you have is a set of alliances. And for that reason, the kings did not need to raise revenues domestically or particularly control the territory. In the 19th century, there were two Anglo-Afghan wars during which essentially the British were convinced that they didn't really want to hold on to Afghanistan, but it did create a situation where Afghanistan emerged and was defined as a kind of negative space, as a buffer between the Russian Empire and the British Empire. So the border effectively was the northern border of British India and the southern border of the Russian Empire. And this status as a buffer state meant that the British Empire felt that it would support the Afghan leaders by providing subventions or funding for their army and for their military, but wouldn't participate directly in the rule of the state. And after the Second Anglo-Afghan War, this process was really consolidated under Abdur Rahman Khan, who attempted to use these resources to create a centralized state. And he did so, He did so using these resources to internally pacify, or some people refer to a process of internal colonization, against the Ghilzai tribes, as I'd mentioned. He was a Durrani again, also with very violent campaigns against the Hazara ethnic minorities and the people of Nuristan, who were converted to Islam only at that time, around 1895, 1898, Nuristan and Kunar, which were known as Kafiristan, the land of the unbelievers, and actually were only subjected to Islamic conversion in the end of the 19th century, were all part of this state-building process. These subventions allowed, interestingly, Abdur Rahman Khan to have an army of 82,000 people. That's approximately the size of the Afghan army today, although only about half of that is at fighting strength. So at the end of the 19th century, the British were able to fund an army for this king, which is either the same size or bigger than the current Afghan National Army, which gives a sense of the scale of the problem of internal pacification, if you want to call it that. Abdur Rahman Khan used an ideology of divine right and Islam, defense of the faith, as his sort of legitimating ideology. And as part of that, he also implemented Sharia courts in the country for the first time, providing the first formal justice system that existed. So he was very revolutionary in his creation and consolidation of, some of the building blocks of what we might call a modern state. But of course, through a great deal of violence. He was succeeded by another Amir, Habibullah, and after the Second World War, the British, after a brief conflict, granted full independence to Afghanistan in 1919. And the new Amir after independence was Amanullah. He was a very interesting character. Amanullah became very inspired by Ataturk, and he implemented a number of very serious modernizing reforms. He institutionalized girls' education. He created a more modern civil service, and he attempted to reform landowning in the countryside, a number of things which become familiar as we go through the 20th century. one of the reasons why he needed to do that was because after independence, those British subventions which supported the state were lost. And so Amanullah was in a situation where he needed, for the first time, to raise domestic revenues. And without a coercive apparatus and a modern state, it's very difficult to do that. Of course, the army already existed, but things like a tax administration, et cetera, didn't. By about the mid-20s, 65% of the country's revenues came from agricultural taxes. It's interesting because the figure by the end of the 1970s was only 2%, and we'll see what kind of effect that process over the course of the 20th century has on the country. Amanullah's reforms were met with resistance from the countryside. That resistance began among the Ghilzai tribes of the southeastern part of Afghanistan, Paktia, or area called Loya Paktia, which is Paktia, Paktika, and Khost provinces. And those Ghilzai tribes actually backed a Tajik warlord who became briefly the Amir, a man named Habibullah as well, or better known as the son of the water carrier. He was in power only for a few months and eventually was replaced by another Durrani monarch who passed away in 1933 and was replaced by Zahir Shah, who remained king until 1973. So the reestablishment of a Durrani monarchy was based around a compact between the state elites and the rural elites, landowners and the religious figures. And they were also supported by, again, this reemergence of Afghanistan as a kind of buffer state, especially after the Second World War, of course. The state gradually expanded its scope and reach, but not very deeply. It never reached very far into the countryside. And in fact, as I said, its ability to extract revenues decreased, and it began to take advantage of its status as a buffer, especially from the 1950s, by again receiving support from the outside. Initially from the United States. One of the interesting projects of that process in the late 1950s was the Helmand River Basin Initiative, which was a massive US-funded dam and irrigation program. Eventually, the state became worried about the US relationship with Pakistan, etc., and turned to the Soviet Union. In the 1960s, the state received a lot of revenue from both the US and the Soviet Union, and there was an interesting scenario in which the irrigation systems of the Helmand River Basin were US funded, the electrification of Helmand was Soviet funded, and essentially the government became a kind of enclave or rentier state where it had a much more important relationship maybe with the external world than with its own rural population anyway. This period was punctuated by some democratizing intervals, a very short one in 1949 till about 1953, and more importantly in the 1960s. In 1964, a very modern constitution was promulgated, which established a democratically elected parliament and a number of different freedoms which would be familiar in liberal democratic countries around the world. And this experiment lasted till 1973, but as the sort of Afghan status as a buffer in the Cold War became more and more problematic, these liberalizing reforms lost their momentum. They were also they were also paralyzed by some of the ways that they were implemented. There was no law on political parties, and the system of the Afghan parliament was constructed in such a way that there wouldn't be political parties there. And there seems to have been historically a fear by Afghan rulers of political parties, and that's true today as well. And the current Afghan parliament is constituted in such a way that very much discourages the development of political parties. But what happened because of that was essentially you had a paralyzed parliament. There were 240 different parties. Every representative was a party. And So the parliament was not able to have a real impact on politics in the country. And there was a reduction in the aid, but all of this aid had generated a lot of new elites as well, because there were aid-funded schools in Kabul, universities, etc., and you had a generation of new elites being produced, but the economy wasn't keeping up to provide work for them, and that change in the class structure seems to have been part of the cause of a coup in 1973. The King Zahir Shah's cousin, Mohammed Daoud, took over and attempted sort of further modernization in the 1970s, but this was cut short. By a further coup in 1979 by the Communist Party, which had been the recipient of a lot of the input of these various elites who'd come through the different lycées and schools. And essentially these educated elites moved in two different directions in the 1970s. They started to generate Islamist parties, and some of the leaders who are even still important today, such as Hekmatyar, were in the 1970s young educated Islamic scholars or scholars of subjects like engineering, etc. Others went into moved towards the communist parties, and indeed, you know, this is a pattern which is seen in developing countries in the 1970s elsewhere as well. So the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, that's PDPA, made a radical attempt at modernizing reforms, even more radical than Amanullah, attempted to formalize equality between men and women in education, in the workplace, in all fields, attempted a land reform, distributing land among clans and also from large landowners to smaller peasant farmers, and this generated again resistance which began as tribal resistance. It began again in the eastern part of the country, and then it very quickly became very wrapped up in resistance by the Islamist parties, which I mentioned. These parties were additionally very much empowered by assistance from Pakistan at first and then the US. Pakistan being the conduit for that assistance shaped the privileging of political Islamic parties against other types of resistance, and these were the jihadi parties, and they became, you know, very important actors for the subsequent 30 years. It's probably familiar to everyone, this conflict went on throughout the 1980s, the Soviet Union supporting the government in Afghanistan. A great deal of human suffering ensued. The US put in a lot of money into the jihadi parties to resist the government, and the result after Soviet withdrawal and the collapse of the Soviet Union was the fall of the PDPA government in 1992 and a coalition of Mujahideen parties which ruled Kabul briefly and then broke into conflict between themselves, internecine conflict, which resulted in the destruction of Kabul, a great deal more human suffering, displacement, refugees in Pakistan and Iran, and a general breakdown of order such that different areas of the country were commanded by local warlords. People were subject to a lot of banditry, checkpoints on the roads, and criminality, and this situation provoked, it's not the only reason, but was one of the main factors that provoked the early rise of the Taliban and the acceptance of the Taliban throughout the south of the country and then increasingly through other parts of the country. Interestingly, the Taliban, although they had a very absolutist ideology, were a fairly decentralized system of government. They didn't have the capacity to implement or deliver services throughout the country, so different parts of the country had a fair amount of autonomy, or individual Taliban commanders had a fair amount of autonomy in different areas. So now, in some areas that resulted in very cruel situations, in other areas some accommodation with local leaders, and that may have helped explain the stability of the Taliban for what in Afghanistan at that point was a relatively long regime. And so just going back to those two questions on the top here, and this isn't a complete table, it's something which is just a sort of exercise I took on. You have the kind of relationship between the state and the society. How did the regime legitimize itself? And Islam was one. There's a mixture of these always, but Islam was a very important legitimizing factor for Abdurrahman Khan at the end of the 19th century that I mentioned, Taliban more recently. But on the left axis there you can see sort of the difference between more decentralized ways of governing and a more central control. And so I've put a few of the regimes in there, and I think what I'm submitting is that people have something like this either implicitly or explicitly in their mind when they think about governing Afghanistan. How is there a legitimate basis for the regime, and how does it manage this relationship between the center and the regional areas? And of course, on the right, you have the attempts at central control and modernizing reforms, where Amanullah and the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, both of these resulted in very swift, severe resistance, very ugly ends for the leaders involved. And of course, the supposition is that by instituting a centralized state, a kind of modern state, and trying to bring development and reform to Afghanistan, the current Afghan government or the US or NATO or we or the World Bank are making the same mistakes again. And by analogy, since it never worked before, it can never work now. I would say that, first of all, the current regime is actually a little more complicated than that. One of the ways in which the current regime was put into place, and this was a choice of the United States in overthrowing the Taliban, was to farm out the work essentially to those warlords and commanders of the Northern Alliance in order to reduce the number of US troops that would have to be put on the ground. The initial UN intervention in Afghanistan was described as a light footprint by Lakhdar Brahimi, the special representative to the Secretary General in 2002 and 2003, in 2001 and 2002. And so in fact, the relationship between the center and the external sort of borderland areas of Afghanistan under the current regime at least started out as being a very cooptative one which probably accentuated differences between the Pashtun south and east and the north, the non-Pashtun center and north of the country. I'm simplifying things a little bit there, but you didn't really have a centralized state. You had a formally centralized constitution. And so one of the big questions that's emerged in the ensuing 4 or 5 years since that time, and about the time I arrived in Afghanistan in 2005, started to be a big question, was how do we deal with subnational governance? It became one of those fashionable terms, and the term in which everybody began describing their programs and trying to think about, I suppose, the extension of what was a very limited central state in Kabul to more realistic control of the rest of the country. And some steps have been taken in that regard, some steps haven't been taken, but the general picture has been one of regression, probably. And so what we want to do is maybe look a little bit at why that is. Just wrapping up, some of the things I would take away from this historical overview wrapping up this history, is that the state has often been one of a number of interests. Capturing the state has been a way to put forward your own particular interest, and in many ways it may still be that. Contestation over places in the cabinet early after 2001 was very important, and cabinet positions initially were doled out based on the sort of military influence of those various commanders. There's a mixture of technocratic leaders and sort of military commander type leaders in the cabinet, but this is probably still a factor. The states in Afghanistan which have survived for any period of time have been dependent on external support, particularly for their security forces, and a kind of political accommodation between the outside powers, the state elites, and the rural elites, which are both agricultural elites and tribal elites and religious elites. Basically, that accommodation centers around the role of Afghanistan as being more of a buffer than being a theater of conflict. And what's happened over the past 30 years is that Afghanistan has become the theater of conflict rather than the buffer. And this is a big change from the periods of time where you had a stable state before. It became obviously a theater of Cold War conflict. It's a proxy theater for the conflict between Pakistan and India over Kashmir. And Pakistan has viewed Afghanistan as a kind of strategic redoubt or strategic depth. And that's one of the reasons Pakistan has tried to support quote-unquote pro-Pakistani governments or parties such as the Taliban in Afghanistan. I think it's clear that they're finding that was not a good long-term solution at the moment. The conflict over influence in Central Asia between NATO and Russia is being played out in Afghanistan, and the conflict over resources between the US, Central Asia, Iran, perhaps we could add China there, centering around things like pipeline routes, has also been played out. So from a state which was supposed to be somewhat left alone and was given the resources just to basically maintain internal order, the situation which Afghanistan finds itself now is very different than it was when those previous state formation exercises took place. And I think that leads us to the very important point that just drawing a historical analogy about some essential Afghanistan or primordial Afghanistan and say that this is the way Afghanistan is, therefore certain types of regime will work and certain types won't, is a mistake. The process that Afghanistan has gone through of conflict over the last 30 years has been extremely important and in changing the nature of the situation there. And that's something that we really need to bear in mind. We shouldn't just jump to conclusions that tribal societies work like this. In many ways, Afghanistan's tribal nature has been degraded a great deal. So I'll run quickly through some of the more recent events, and maybe these are more familiar to people as well. Afghanistan's going through a kind of triple transition, I guess, in political science speak. It's a political transition, economic transition, and a security transition. These are all going in different directions at the same time. But the broad features of the political transition were the Bonn Agreement. And I would say one of the most important things to note about the Bonn Agreement is that it was not a peace agreement in the traditional sense of the word, in that, you know, some of the major players or parties to the conflict were excluded, particularly the Taliban, but others as well, the Hekmatyar part of the Hezb Islami party. The Bonn Agreement called for a constitution. The constitution that was drafted features a strong presidential system, and this was, I think, partly a product of a desire for the international community, maybe the US in particular, to have a single interlocutor to deal with. That constitution later also developed a voting system, which, as I mentioned earlier, was aimed at not promoting the development of political parties, because there's a big fear that the only organized political parties in Afghanistan are those warlord parties. And both the population and the government was very fearful that they would empower what are called the Tanzim parties, the Mujahideen parties. The use of factional power holders to carry out competing agendas, particularly the counter-terror agenda, has been a feature of the politics, and it's only more recently really that a genuine earnest effort to have the state reach out and discipline and control these power holders has happened. It started in around 2004 and 2005, where the central state tried to gather its own revenues from customs posts, which are the main source of revenues. And of course, the political situation is characterized by a lot of corruption. And a little bit, in a second, I'll talk about the sort of nature of that corruption, but I want to keep sort of moving through. The political transition has left Afghanistan with a formally very centralized state. This echoes the situation also before, during the PDPA period. You have 34 provinces, there are 2 new ones, and a large number of districts. Both of these are just deconcentrated levels of the central government. They're not a local government in any way. They don't have their own budget. They have no revenue responsibilities or privileges. And essentially, you can't speak about a provincial government per se. You speak about the local representatives and line ministries. This is something which is something frequently misunderstood when people talk about their prescriptions. You do have one form of local government, though, which are municipalities. Municipalities on paper have revenue responsibilities and do collect revenues. They also have service delivery responsibilities, which are a bit unclear but are important. And actually municipalities, because some of them are rural, are actually a very important unit and could be a very important unit. One estimate is up to about 40% of the population may live or soon live in municipalities. And so if eventually municipalities have elected governments, are able to raise revenues and have clearly defined service responsibilities, they may be a very important part of the picture. At the moment, a lot of them are very disempowered, have limited revenue, fiscal capacity, and work on municipalities is a very promising area, but one that hasn't gone very far yet. And so the government consists of the presidency, and the governors are his representative. There's an institution called the Independent Directorate of Local Governance, which is essentially a local governance ministry which manages the governor's offices. But it's a relatively new institution. That role used to fall under the Ministry of Interior and was very problematic at that time. It's still something which is in flux, and we can maybe talk about it in the discussion. Then you have ministries which formally are responsible for delivering services, and they have their departments down the line in the provinces. Ministries vary very widely in their capacity. Most of the successful service delivery from ministries has been through a combination of central government contracting or management and the partnership with NGOs or other providers of the actual services. You have a parliament which is elected, as I said, on a single non-transferable vote system. This system we could talk about in detail if you like. It's used almost nowhere in the world. It's very complex. It doesn't encourage the growth of political parties, and probably isn't the appropriate system, but unfortunately is the system at the moment. It may be reopened before scheduled parliamentary elections in 2010. There are elected provincial councils, but the roles of these provincial councils are still very unclear, and their privileges, their funding, their basis is unclear, and there are problems with their role. The Constitution also calls for elected district councils, elected village councils, and elected municipal councils. These are a lot of elected councils for a very centralized state, and I think the balance between representation and responsibility isn't something that's been effectively struck yet. It is an ongoing discussion, but it's a discussion which is maybe not yet happening at the levels it needs to happen. It looks a little bit like this. We can go back to this during the discussion if I need to explain it in more detail, but I think it's better if we move through that at the moment. The security transition, I mean, I'll make just a couple of points. One is that Afghanistan did not have a large peacekeeping force in place right after 2001. In fact, the only peacekeeping force was restricted to Kabul until late 2004. What there was in other parts of the country were U.S. Special Operation Forces and some other countries doing basically counter-terror activity, chasing al-Qaeda, chasing Taliban leadership, etc., but not securing the population. And the government of Afghanistan called frequently, many times during that period for ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force, to expand outside of Kabul. The Americans blocked it. And it was only until about 2005 and 2006 that a substantial number of troops moved into the southern and eastern parts of the country. In 2004, you had Scandinavian German troops and British troops in the north. That was a relatively peaceful area anyway. And you have a more complex, the security situation has basically been going downhill since that time. There was, a kind of big overestimation of the degree to which the Taliban had been defeated. The Taliban is now a much more complex, multifaceted type of movement or insurgency than it used to be. It has these tribal elements where tribes have felt left out by the current dispensation. There's criminal activity going on, banditry. There's the Taliban protecting farmers, opium crops, and gaining support in that way. And there is a genuine rising amount of anger and discontent over the use of force by international forces, particularly air power and these special operations forces. Often it may not be ISAF operations, but having two military forces in the country, one, the U.S. Operation Enduring Freedom and the International Security Assistance Force, understandably creates a lot of confusion in the mind of people. We'll touch, I have a slide on aid, so we'll touch on economic transition a little bit further along. Just maybe you want to look on the left-hand side, you can see between 2003 and 2007 the inaccessibility map of the UN. And the map on the right sort of shows that there are different parts of the political Taliban or the political insurgency which are operating in different areas. The red map has gotten worse since 2007, and there's now areas of provinces bordering Kabul which are inaccessible for internationals like ourselves, but also make access. Maybe another 5. Even local NGOs find operating very difficult, and staff have to purge themselves of any ID, phone numbers, etc., and travel under a great deal of threat, our Afghan colleagues in particular. So in this kind of declining situation or problematic situation, there have been a lot of prescriptions put forward. One is the Afghanistan National Development Strategy, which is Afghanistan's version of the PRSP, Poverty Reduction Strategy paper. Currently, we have the surge, which President Obama has approved the deployment of 17,000 additional U.S. troops initially, and probably more to come. And there is certainly some truth to the idea that a changing situation in Iraq has affected thinking about Afghanistan. I think in the discussion would be a good time to talk about where we think that would go. And of course, as I said, subnational governance has become the big thing. And a lot of that has been carried out, that discussion has been carried out in a way which hasn't really come to very much clarity on the end point, particularly around the question of a more aggressive decentralization where provincial governments would become provincial governments, so to speak, have budgets of their own, etc. Or whether we're talking about a little bit of devolution or deconcentration within ministries, etc. The other thing which has come really to the fore as the insurgency has gotten worse is people are trying to come up with what they call locally based solutions, empowering tribal councils, empowering tribal militias or Arbakai or Lashkars in order to defend communities, etc. And a lot of these types of initiatives are in quite advanced stages of experimentation right now. I'll reserve my own view on that for the discussion. But I would say about decentralization or federalism, this is a broad ethnic map which vastly simplifies the situation in Afghanistan, but you can see that even within areas which are of one ethnic group, you have other groups mixed in. So simply breaking the country up into a series of ethnic federal states is likely to produce new minorities elsewhere. And I think this is an argument which I think falls true in the Balkans, etc. When you have ethnically divided states, people often jump to federalism as a conclusion. But if your federal states just produce new minorities, it doesn't necessarily lessen the chance for conflict. What are some of the things that's worked? Let me just make sure I've taken stock here. And this is maybe where I get into a little more of my World Bank hat, because it seems that, and it could be indoctrination, but some of the things which seem to have worked well in Afghanistan have had some World Bank involvement. Not all things that have worked have had World Bank involvement, and not all things with World Bank involvement have worked. But some of the things that have worked, that have been quite significant, have. One is a fairly sound national budget process has been developed. One in which when donors give money through multi-donor trust funds or directly to the national budget, they can actually be fairly sure that the money is, at least to the point of disbursement, going to its intended purpose. And the public financial management performance of Afghanistan's central budget is actually higher than the average for low-income countries around the world. It's about on par with middle-income countries. You do have a great deal of corruption, but the corruption is actually centered on diversion of state funds before it arrives in state coffers, abuse of office in terms of positions and posts, buying offices which provide access, etc. And then, of course, corruption at the point of service delivery could well be a big problem. But I'll even point to a couple of service delivery models where that problem has been reduced. But there's also a problem where the budget is not being executed fully, and there are a number of reasons for this, but it does provide a challenge to the idea that, for example, on the Paris Declaration principles, donors should give more money to the budget, etc. Secondly, a big area of success has been provision of health and education services, although mainly this has been so far in terms of access. Access to primary health, at least being within half a day of a primary health center, that kind of thing, has gone from about 20% of the population to over 90% of the population in 4 years. And maternal mortality has been reduced by 25%, admittedly from an extremely low baseline, perhaps the lowest baseline in the world. Access to education similarly has expanded very rapidly, but this expansion in both services, brings serious problems in terms of the quality. Secondly, small-scale rural development initiatives have been undertaken in most of the provinces or all of the provinces of the country through a community-driven development program, which involves the election of local councils who then decide how to spend a block grant. All of this undertaken through the facilitation of an international or domestic NGO. This is called the National Solidarity Program, and there's more details on it here, but I think it may be something that we'll get to discussing. A few key issues about aid, just to orient us, and then I'll just get to the end of the presentation, the last few slides. Afghanistan is extremely aid dependent, but as I said in the history, it's been aid dependent somewhat throughout its history, but it's more aid dependent than ever before, and about 90% of public spending comes from external sources. That external spending is organized through a very complicated structure. Only some of it goes through what we call the core budget. That in any other country would be the budget, the national budget. The core budget is the budget of the country, the money which is actually in the hands of the government. And that's divided into an ordinary or recurrent budget, which mainly handles salaries, and a development budget that handles capital expenditures. The problem with that kind of situation is you don't necessarily relate the recurrent implications of a capital expenditure together very well. So integrating the budget is an important medium-term task. About 2/3 of public spending go through the core budget. And the domestic revenues, the revenues that the state raises itself, mainly from customs, cover non-security salaries, basically. If you want to kind of picture in your mind, basically the civil service is paid by domestic revenues. The army and the police are being paid externally, and any kind of development spending is being paid externally. And then you have the external budget, which is money which is recorded at least, but is spent directly by donors through a range of different mechanisms. You have a third budget, of course, which is the stuff that nobody knows anything about. This raises a lot of questions, obviously, in terms of country ownership. How much discretion does the government have? Even where donors like ourselves at the bank and others give money to the core budget, often the discretion is not very wide because that money is earmarked for specific programs. We try very hard through our multi-donor trust fund to make donors give an equal amount of non-earmarked money for every amount of money they give that's earmarked, to try to give them the government some discretion. But effectively, out of about a $2 billion budget, the government has discretion over about less than $100 million of aid money. So an extremely limited scope for really domestically driven national policy. I would say also that there's an extremely limited political scope for that because cabinet government doesn't really function for the reasons I mentioned. Okay, how do we deal with subnational governance then? The key questions are, and I really am wrapping up now, how to take a centralized, very centralized, formally centralized state with low capacity, make it more effective, more responsive in a society that's very decentralized, and how to harmonize the kind of responses we need now to the crisis that Afghanistan faces in the short term with something which is going to lead towards a sustainable and viable state in the long term, and how to manage all of this through a very aid-dependent situation and one in which national ownership is very hard to produce. Sorry, seem to have gone. So, maybe there was a copy there. One prescription, and there's 6 points here. One is that the central line ministries need to be the service providers. My argument for that is that we're building on a functioning national budget. To rapidly decentralize to provincial budgets would increase the accountability problems that the country faces, increase the capacity constraints that the country faces. The only way forward in the medium term is to use a unitary budget and but continue perhaps using public or state non-state partnerships to deliver the services. The policy implication is that aid money should go through the budget. Again, going back to the beginning, I really want people to engage with this prescription aggressively if necessary. That means that provincial governors, who are the provincial level representatives, need to be subordinated to the ministries in the delivery of the services. Right now, they play a dual role. The ministry is supposed to deliver the services, but when they get to dispersing the money, the provincial governor is able to sign off on what the expenditure is for. So that hampers the development of a nationally based policy. But the ministries are very centralized, so they need to be deconcentrated. And we can talk in the discussion about how one might achieve that. This is the evidence they need to be deconcentrated. Blue on top is the amount of public spending that's aimed towards provinces. Sorry, blue on the top is the amount of money that's dispersed at the center. But if you look on the bottom, the orange is the amount of that money which is supposed to be used at a provincial level. What it means is that there's very little provincial level discretion, even within the line ministries, about how the budget is made, what money is used for. For example, a provincial education department needs to consult the center every time it hires a teacher, every time it purchases chairs. So deconcentration of ministries, even within the current structure, could give you a lot. This is just a graph that shows the central budgeting produces very unequal distribution of resources across provinces. Third, this central provision of services isn't going to be enough because of the capacity constraints. So you need a bottom-up transfer of resources to communities and districts, and that should build on the community-driven development program that I mentioned before. Fourth, the empowerment of communities through community-driven development needs to be supplemented by more responsiveness in the public institutions, and the appropriate electoral system is more important in that. For example, there should be local constituencies, whereas at the moment the single non-transferable vote is on a provincial level constituency. It's very important that we sequence these reforms in a way which takes account of all of the different constraints the context places upon us. These are cultural, but they're also capacity constraints, accountability constraints, and my argument essentially is that an overly rapid decentralization would increase the risk of a failed reform. As you saw from the pie charts, the amount of public funds that would be affected by a decentralization reform is about 69%. There's a concept in decentralization called contingent risk, which is if the reform fails, how much of the public purse is at risk? And in this case, it would be 69%. So having a very aggressive reform, while it might seem attractive in a difficult situation, has such a high risk of failure that it could make the situation much, much worse than it is now. Last slide. Second last slide. There are short-term initiatives are going to be necessary, but they should bear in mind a more coherent view of where the state is trying to get to in the middle and the long term. And the first 5 points are essentially some of what I would put forward as those medium-term goals. Deconcentrated line ministries within a relatively centralized state with a unitary budget, but a fiscal transfer to communities and districts which is managed by them in modest amounts, coupled with a more effective electoral system. And so the questions that we might sort of think about, things that I would say are challenges that my presentation hasn't answered. One is, given that security is the biggest concern, are any of the reforms that I'm proposing something which is likely to happen, politically feasible or practical in a situation where the security is getting so much worse? Does subnational governance reform have the potential to improve security? Does development relate to security, or not at all? It could be that security is entirely something which is out of the hands of reformers of subnational governance. Should we deal with different parts of the country in different speeds? That's the asymmetric approaches. How do we deal with revenue capacity? If there's a peace process, then the question of a technical reform of subnational governance might be moot anyway, because what you may be discussing is how much power to hand over to competitors for the state power. So these are the challenges that I see to my own presentation. Maybe they'll give a good jumping off point for the discussion. I'm sorry, I've gone 5 or 10 minutes a little longer than I intended, but I'm happy to stay as long as you are.
Thank you very much, Hamish. We have about 20 minutes for a Q&A, and I'm sure this has elicited a lot of questions from you. In the interest of time, I'd like to take 3 questions at a time. Please identify yourself and your background, your affiliation. Also, I'd like to invite you to, as Dr. Nixon says, be aggressive in engaging him with your questions, but also be aggressively short and aggressively concise. Okay, first 3 questions. Gary, yes, and first 2 questions. Gary, please.
Gary Roden, Asia visitor for a month or so at CAG. When I look at what you're presenting here, the big question that wasn't addressed, although I did notice you had something in your slides about economic programs, is how the political economy of this might work. And I'm not quite sure how you can look at questions of governance and institutional architecture and questions of decentralisation and all of these other institutions without relating that to what sort of economy might generate the sort of constituents for the institutions that you might see as preferred. And all that I know about the economy of Afghanistan is that there's a tremendous amount of dependence upon selling opium, and that this is an enormous advantage for the Taliban or anyone else who wants to exploit that. So could you say something about what sort of economic vision might go with the institutional preferences that you're prescribing here?
Yeah. My name is Amtal. I'm from MPM course from Pakistan. One part of my question has already been asked about economy. I'm also interested in what kind of political, and by political I don't mean governance, I mean the political parties, because that feeling that, political parties can create problems, it has been there all the way. But I think vacuum also creates problems. And that might be, we are culturally and politically, we are here from where Ahmad Shah Durrani was. So talking about governance is good, but what about the political basis on which we are placing that governance?
As an outsider, both of these questions have to do with the kind of social bases of politics in Afghanistan, and these are things which, as outsiders, we have less access to, and I think we have to be humble about the fact that we have less access to them, but very important. The economic basis of the state when it was attempting to assert itself in the 1920s was to establish certain kinds of agricultural tax, and the local presence of the state was established at that time through what was normally called a malik, which would be often a locally appointed representative of the state who, among other things, was given tax farming privileges. And those reforms, as we've seen, produced violent resistance. They were not the only ones that produced violent resistance, but the system did stay in place, and taxes were raised from the countryside throughout most of the 20th century until essentially order broke down. But they had already reduced massively as a share of the government's income over the 20th century. Of course, At that time, opium wasn't a factor, but export agriculture was a very important factor in the 1960s and 1970s. And I believe in the late 1960s, Afghanistan was the largest raisin producer in the world. So export agriculture did have a historical basis. It's been incredibly degraded by both conflict and its effects on irrigation systems, population movements, etc. Land tenure has become very unclear over the course of successive regimes. And of course, there have been years of successive drought through the 1990s and the current century. So the agricultural system is really has been on its knees, but there is rehabilitation of those irrigation systems. Opium, being a very hardy crop which can grow in a lot of parts of the country and which is quite resilient to different kinds of irrigation, etc., has been grown into that place. Obviously, also price factors have driven that to some degree. The current financial basis of the state, as I said, is drawn from customs revenue, and obviously Afghanistan does occupy a potentially very advantageous trading position between Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent, and that's seen as part of the kind of economic model. Economic growth in Afghanistan since 2001 has actually been very dynamic. It kicked off in 2002, 2003, the Afghan fiscal year straddles, but at 32%, it's been sliding downwards, but it remains, I think, at about 10%. But it's obviously a very distorted, urbanized, aid-driven form of economic growth. It's not clear how much of that money is reinvested in the country, etc. One of the implications of that situation for decentralization structurally, which I bear in mind, is that 90% of the government's revenues currently derive from 6 provinces, those provinces which have borders and border crossings. So a decentralization of revenue responsibilities without any kind of intergovernmental fiscal system seems to me a very dangerous move, because it would simply enrich provinces which are already rich, and it would further impoverish provinces which are currently impoverished. What one needs to do is get resources to the center and then back out on a more equitable basis than they are at the moment, and that seems to me to be a political economic basis for choosing the sequence that I've pointed to here today. The question of whether opium cultivation will be something that fades out in Afghanistan is very difficult. It's very difficult to say. But opium cultivation has become increasingly concentrated in the areas of the country where insecurity is the worst. So I would say that it is not only a cause of insurgency, but in fact has been becoming more of a symptom. The Taliban, of course, were the only government to successfully ban opium cultivation in Afghanistan, although they lost a lot of legitimacy in doing so. And of course, they still made money from trading stored opium. Another advantage that the crop has is that it can be stored. So you see a concentration and a linkage between insecurity and opium cultivation, of course. But I think most people who have sensible ideas about counter-narcotics policy in Afghanistan would focus their policy much more on trafficking and the impact that money has on state structures rather than the farm level situation. I don't know if that really answers the question, and I'm happy to follow up. I agree with you that the vacuum of political parties will be a big problem. I come from a democratization background, and I see Afghanistan as a country which is at a very, very early stage of even thinking about or developing its new institutions. It hasn't even had a second election yet. My view of democratization is that second and third elections are far more important than first elections. We haven't even got there yet. We're trying to have one in August. I would say that election is at some risk. So without the opportunity to see any rotation in power, it's very hard for people to accept the legitimacy of these institutions. But I think the short-term considerations of having a strong presidency and trying to disempower the parliament through a single non-transferable vote system were very short-sighted decisions that were pushed by particular interests and which don't serve the long-term development of parties. For better or for worse, the parliament is the only locus of sort of opposition in the country at the moment, which can produce discussion around alternative models. And, you know, sort of as predicted, that discussion is pretty monopolized by mujahideen groups at the moment, you know, many of whom at root are as conservative as the Taliban anyway. So I think the disempowerment of the parliament through the electoral system is a big problem, and I would agree with you that one needs to think about filling that vacuum. Another aspect to that question is that the sort of Paris consensus, this is something that I've been thinking about a little bit recently. I don't have a really settled view on it, and I'd be interested in yours, but the Paris Declaration consensus that one should use aid in a way which supports state building, and in particular the kind of DAC, OECD, and DFID consensus about Paris in fragile states is that you need to pay particular attention to state building. And of course, as a person who works in the World Bank, everything I do is oriented towards the support of that type of approach. I do think, however, there is a risk that in supporting the budget, in supporting national development strategies, one runs the risk of not supporting the development of a strong society. Probably in Afghanistan, not necessarily a traditional Eastern European kind of civil society, but a system by which autonomous centers of power and ideas can emerge. And I think one of the risks we're running in Afghanistan is, you know, it's either the government or it's the tribes, and there isn't a huge amount of thinking and effort going into how we can develop maybe the social bases that would eventually flower into kind of political parties, etc. But, you know, democratization is a very long-term process, and I think to expect it to have taken root in Afghanistan right now it's not something that people in this room should do anyway.
Other questions? Yes. Toby, the gentleman, and then the lady in the back. Yes, can we start with you, Toby?
Hamish, Toby Carroll, Centre on Asia and Globalisation at the LKY School. This is just a question out of curiosity. I've been doing some research on the BTC pipeline that runs from Baku to Ceyhan in the Mediterranean in Turkey, and looking at the impact of the politics of that pipeline, I guess. I was just wondering whether you had any sort of idea of how the TAPI pipeline was proceeding, this proposed, or this idea of a pipeline from Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan and India. Because in discussions that I had with people in the Caucasus and elsewhere, they sort of seemed to think it was still a possibility, still on the cards. So I was wondering whether you could sort of tell us how that's going, and whether, you know, and what you think the impact of something like that would be on a country like Afghanistan.
I'm at the Risk Management Institute, also at NUS. Drawing upon your concluding observations in response to the last query, and also the fifth slide you had in your policy recommendations, where you asked there's a need to invoke the political, historical, and social legacy of Afghanistan in order to design and mediate effective strategies. If you cast aside your hat as a World Bank specialist and draw upon experiences of the last 5 years in Afghanistan, and you look at the relationship between the center and the provinces, there's no homogeneous model as such. Could you elaborate on, just on your observations on what are the forces that are mediating success or otherwise? I was motivated to ask this question particularly after reading a news story which I recalled a couple of years ago. I think it's the province of Helmand that borders Iran. There's a very progressive governor who took up infrastructure projects. Herat, I'm sorry, thank you. Infrastructure, women were very proactively roped into administrative and other education and a whole bunch of other endeavors. And eventually it was a breakdown to the central government that just sort of destroyed and cut off the spigot of aid as well. And so clearly, Kabul was to blame. And what this also did was it thwarted any advances that the Taliban was attempting to make out there. And they were utterly marginalized in the process. And perhaps from the bottom looking up, are there any lessons that we can draw upon? Yeah.
Could you use the microphone, please, so we can catch you in the video? And below.
Okay. My name is Nadia Khan, and I'm an LLM Human Rights and Global Justice student. My question is in regards, just to get your views on the National Solidarity Program and local solutions more generally, because when I conceive of the triple transition, political, economic, security, I see the three as involving a set of interconnected variables. And when it comes to local solutions, I think of such variables as the establishment of local economies, alternative livelihoods to respond to the opium trade's link to security, and security is a precondition to development that the World Bank prioritizes. So just wanted to get your views, considering that interdependence between all those variables within the three spheres. What are your thoughts on the local solutions?
I mean, most of what I know about TAPI pipeline, is what I read in the newspaper of the news service. I know that there have been meetings. There have been trilateral and quadrilateral meetings every year on it, and at these meetings they talk about it being a project which is potentially viable, etc. I mean, the route for that project at the moment is untravelable by anyone, any engineers, etc., etc. Even road engineers are frequently kidnapped there, etc. You would be traveling through Herat, which, as you point out, used to be very peaceful, does have considerably more problems now than it did. But then you go into Nimruz and Helmand and into Pakistan from there, and it's just inconceivable to think of how, in the current situation, one would have any kind of engineering works going on, I think. But I know that the political mechanism, TAPI mechanism, still has sort of annual meetings or biannual meetings. I think in terms of its impact on the country, I mean, there's a history of exportation of natural gas from the north of Afghanistan to the Soviet Union, and this was actually a source of revenues during the 60s and 70s, which I failed to mention. Those are flowing again, and there are very large untapped reserves of natural gas in Afghanistan. There are other resource to Central Asian republics, yeah. And so that has in the past formed a basis. Actually, two of the questions kind of link up a little bit, because what in the past that formed some income generation for the northern sort of fiefdom of Abdul Rashid Dostum. And a lot of the challenge has been to centralize the resources, and this bears on your question, Rupinder. But I think, you know, the sort of resource curse is something which Afghanistan is confronting. There's a concession for, I think, potentially the largest copper mine in the world, or the second largest copper mine in the world, which has already been granted to a Chinese consortium or company which is beginning preliminary works already. We're working with the Afghan government on accession to the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative and all this kind of stuff. But you know, there are going to be challenges in securing those revenues and in distributing those revenues towards services. I don't know very much about kind of pipeline politics, how revenue from transshipment works, et cetera, so I wouldn't want to speculate too much. But I think it would form part and parcel of a set of challenges related to resources that the country is already facing. So perhaps we should be trying to build those institutions anyway in anticipation of a potential pipeline. But security-wise, right now, I just cannot, you know, I just don't see how you would have something that would be such a gigantic target being built. In terms of the provincial resources, the Herat and also another northern province, Balkh, are a very interesting story, and current in the first few years, and at the moment an eastern province called Nangarhar. And there really are two sides to it, and you know, to be honest, this is something I wrestle with. Herat was under, I wouldn't call him a progressive governor, but he was a very locally powerful governor named Ismail Khan, who was the first local leader to resist on a large scale the Soviet invasion and gained a huge amount of legitimacy from that. And he did produce a number of, but yeah, I mean, he didn't have a particularly among the hardest line view on women's education, etc. But basically he implemented a number of infrastructure projects which were very important for Herat, and he bought electricity from Iran. So when Kabul still didn't have electricity and Herat was electrified, I remember visiting Herat in 2005 and 2006, and there were traffic lights, and people obeyed them, and it was quite a remarkable place compared to Kabul, and there has been some degradation of that since then. There was a big moment in 2004 when Ashraf Ghani, who was the finance minister, came into a confrontation with Ismail Khan over the remittance of customs revenue, and eventually flew out and stood him down and came back with a suitcase full of $20 million. I guess more than one suitcase. But this, at that point then, there was a system put in place to more effectively remit the customs revenues from the Herat-Iran border crossing, which is probably the second or third busiest, probably the third busiest after Tajikistan and Pakistan border crossing in the country. So it's an interesting case of the challenges I'm pointing to. One is Herat raised a lot of revenue through customs. What Ismail Khan did was not any particular institutional reform. He just kept the money and spent it in Herat. And there are 34 other provinces in which people are, you know, having the highest, you know, there are parts of Afghanistan where scurvy is still endemic. So the question was, can you run provinces like that with some locally based revenue but still secure the relatively limited source of revenue for the central government in order to redistribute it? The problem is it's now been all centralized and the government's not very good at redistributing it. So you've seen a decline in some places. It's also produced a situation where certain governors, there are three in particular, Sherzai in Nangarhar, Atta in Balkh, and Ismail Khan before he was removed. Part of that process was he was brought to Kabul and made Ministry of Energy and Water. So this co-optation process took place. But it remains an open question. A lot of people see these sort of effective governors as the model of the way forward, not only Afghans, but also American commanders, other people who are looking for quick ways of dealing with the situation. But, you know, and Jalalabad in the eastern part of the country is something I understand is where there's been a lot of recent development. People view the governor very favorably. The question is, where is he getting the money, and whose money should it be, and what is the system by which you would fairly distribute that money? And I think these are questions that have to be answered. On the other hand, if you can get money back to the province, maybe the governor should have a role in figuring out what the priorities are among the different sectors and things. And it's that kind of architecture which is crucial. What I think now is the situation is that it's somewhat confused, such that were you to decentralize, you would only empower the already powerful, and you wouldn't necessarily really get to the poor provinces where, you know, the differences between these provinces is immense. In Nangarhar or Balkh, you have big staff, big governor's mansion, palace, and there are other places where the governor's office might be one room, and half of their tashkil or staffing establishment might be empty. So that's sort of that question. How do development, security, and et cetera relate to each other? I mean, this is the sort of magic question that's on everybody's mind. And there was a period of time where everybody sort of fell back on the truism that development and security and governance are all interrelated. So we need to address all three at once. I think we've reverted to a little bit more of a realistic position, which is if the only development you can do is through NGOs, and NGOs get killed when they go somewhere, and if the governor of the province, of the district, gets killed when he goes there, then maybe security comes first. So the sequencing, it's more the sequencing after immediate, what they call kinetic activities, that seems to be the sort of question that's occupying people's minds at the moment. The problem with things like NSP is that the reason why NSP works reasonably well, and it has a lot of problems, is that it takes time and engagement by the facilitating partner to implement, because you need to spend time getting consensus among the community that they want the program in the first place, building consensus on the procedures of the program, facilitating the meetings, having an election of a community council so that people view it as legitimate. And all these things take time, and it doesn't seem that you can skip that. So the question becomes, what can you do in the immediate short term to produce some kind of stabilizing effect? And what people seem to be jumping to are sort of, let's engage with tribal leaders. And that's a situation which works in some parts of the country. One of the sort of outgrowths of the Ghilzai rebellions that I mentioned in the earlier 20th century is that when they eventually were co-opted into the monarchy, the Ghilzais in southeastern Afghanistan were given a lot of privileges. They never really had intrusive political agents imposed upon them. They were exempt from conscription and taxes. It's actually true even today that the Ghilzai tribes of that region are more coherent and homogenous than in other parts of the country. So in that part of the country, you can find a tribal leader to engage with. In Kandahar, tribal leadership has been degraded and mixed up. Tribes live among each other, so a tribal leader in a district may not necessarily be the leader of the district. So anytime you take a shortcut, you risk doing not conflict-sensitive development. You risk putting resources into a situation which is unstable. Where does that leave us? I don't really know, but it seems to me that only through producing more of a demonstration effect in the parts of the country where you can implement effective development programs will you gradually build legitimacy in other parts of the country. But I actually think that, you know, there are so many intervening variables which cause insecurity other than lack of development in Afghanistan, that to expect by producing development projects in insecure areas to resolve the problem of insecurity, that's a naive solution. I don't think that relationship is that tight. And people actually have seen, you know, where you go and build a school, well, the Taliban come and burn it down. What you need is an area in which people are interested in having a school, and you need other things which are necessary conditions, like at least more constraint on the activities of the Taliban in Pakistan, etc. There are all kinds of external factors. So,
thank you, Hamish. We have kept you far longer than we intended to, and
or
we've also
the other way around.
and we've taken you away from your break, which is very badly needed by now. So let me end by, well, apologizing that the title of this presentation that I forced it upon you is, in a sense, an unfair one. I mean, how do you govern Afghanistan is like asking the question, how do you tame a porcupine? And I guess the answer is very, very carefully. Please join me in thanking Dr. Nixon for coming to Singapore and taking time from his break to address you. Thank you also for coming. And I will not tell you where Dr. Nixon stays at the moment, because I'm sure he wants to enjoy the rest of his break before he returns to Kabul this weekend. So thank you very much, James.